and welcome back to the White Coat Club. My name is Lindsay, and I am one of the counselors at MinPrep. Today, I've got my fellow counselors here with me, Nicole and Michaela. And today, we're going to be debriefing a bit on the 2023-2024 admission cycle, in particular talking about BSMD programs. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe to get more BSMD and med school admission advice. All right, Michaela, kick us off. What are some changes you saw in the admission cycle this year?
Yeah, I think there was a good mix of details from the BSMD programs themselves and the colleges that we can talk about, as well as some themes that we saw across applications and even essays for applicants, what they brought to the table. But as far as, starting with the details from the universities and the BSMD programs, I would say one of the biggest switches that happened this year is that, over COVID, we saw a lot of the BSMD programs move to virtual interviews. And this year, it seems like everything kind of swung back the other way, and so many more of them went back to in-person interviews. I feel like last year it was still a little 50-50 of how many programs were in person versus still continuing virtual. And now I feel like it's mostly back to the way it was before the pandemic of the number of programs that are doing in-person interviews. So that was kind of one of the biggest takeaways as far as details about how we approached and prepared students for this admission cycle.
Yeah, there definitely were programs that still had like virtual stuff, or if you were if you were an out-of-state student, sometimes they didn't make you come in. But some schools also didn't care, and they didn't care if you were from California and it was for a program on the East Coast, you were still having to fly out. So that is something to kind of start to prepare for mentally and financially, potentially having to pay for some in-person interviews and the
I
flights.
think a couple of my students that were invited to interview at University of Houston's HMed program, they were given an option, and a couple of them decided to fly out, whereas a couple of them decided to do the virtual option. And then there was, I believe it was NJIT or Stevens, I can't remember which one of those, but kind of gave students a similar option, and I had students fly out for that one.
I think it was for NJT's like honors college.
Okay, that sounds right, yeah.
So I think that's what it was. So yeah, there definitely is some options. Do you guys think that there's an advantage doing in person or virtual?
I prefer in person, I think.
Mhm.
Um, I think it just gives and every student's gonna have their own, strengths and weaknesses, but I think for the types of students that they're looking for, typically, someone with emotional maturity and the ability to really speak to someone, I think that seeing the body language and seeing where they carry themselves, will have like a huge advantage. But that's just my preference.
I
Yeah,
agree.
I think it shows, demonstrated interest and commitment. So I think that that definitely swings, odds in your favor. I think, if it's possible to visit these schools beforehand, before the interviews, and then you can gain, gather information for their YS essays, that's even better. So if you're able to be like returning to the campus, that's even better. But of course, we know that's not financially feasible for everybody, just preferences.
I actually think it's more beneficial, even just for the student too. Even if they just go that one time, it kind of amplifies the magnitude of really what they're doing.
Mhm.
Getting to meet these people in person, and it's really easy to not grasp that magnitude and that responsibility behind a screen. And you're
Mhm.
writing all these essays, you're doing all this stuff, but it's still kind of something like out in the distance. But when you're actually on campus and saying like, wow, this could be me in this classroom next year doing this, I think it makes it a little bit more real.
And it also probably brings a little bit of weight to your interview answers, even. It makes it more real, more tangible, and you're probably answering more, um, professionally and with a little bit more passion because you do feel how real it is.
And you're committing to 8 years, 6 to 8 years, I guess, at a place. And so you want to make sure it's like the right place for you. And if you get accepted to multiple programs, it might be nice just to help you make the right choice ultimately for you too.
Oh yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yeah, I had a student this cycle who was accepted to University of South Carolina, their BSMD program, and they had done a virtual interview. So to make the decision, they were accepted and they booked a flight three
Yeah.
days later to go visit the campus to make that final decision. So even if, yeah, even if you do a virtual interview, still before you commit to something, make a flight.
Yeah, exactly. And then, a lot of times for the interviews, they'll take you like on little tours of like the medical school, or, you get to talk to like a medical school panel and things like that, which they might do in the virtual stuff too, like a virtual tour and, a virtual panel. But yeah, the in-person really just helps you get the feel of the place and the environment and the surrounding areas, and just make sure it's somewhere that you feel like you would
Mhm.
thrive at the end of the day. So yeah, visits are always a helpful kind of way.
I know Nova Southeastern is very good about that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I feel like
Oh
they do
yeah.
get the kids really excited when they go
Yeah.
there. Like they have a multiple day kind of event going on.
Mhm.
I think that it does help kids see the magnitude. Like I had a couple kids who got into their BSDO version, and then got into also like their home state, like BSMD, and actually picked the BSDO at Nova Southeastern, I think just because they did do such a good job. Um,
Mhm.
like selling themselves to the students. And I had other students back when like ECU had their program, kind of the same thing. They like really, the interviews were almost like let's get you excited about coming here as well and picking us over, an Ivy League
Yeah.
or another BSMD program or whatever it might be. So kind of twofold, I think, the interviews.
I always say that. I've had multiple students go there and I always tell students if they were on the fence about applying, um, like, if you get the opportunity to go and do the interview, it'll really change. It could really
Mhm.
change your opinion about it. Um, and they always come back and say they had the best time.
Yes. Yep. Important. It's like obviously expensive, and it's a bit of a hassle too, because obviously they're under 18 a lot of the times and haven't flown anywhere by themselves. So the parents are taking them to the interview. So it's not just the student having to go, but the parent as well. Um, and so it is a lot. It is a big commitment, but I think it does pay off and does help the student make a choice. One other interview change that we kind of saw too was Hofstra switching from like their traditional interview to MMI, the multiple mini interview. It's been a few years since I had a student interview there. I want to say maybe it was like in like 2021 or so. So I'm not sure when this change was made, but that was something that I noticed that Hofstra changed to the MMI. Do you guys know when that happened?
I just know it was before this application cycle, but I'm not sure when it
Yeah,
made the change.
It was this
I think it
year.
was definitely this year. It was this year. Yeah. And it kind of surprised me that they were still doing the Casper
Yeah.
Yeah,
also. So I'm curious if this upcoming year they'll do the same or not.
but
So
I
Mhm.
that'll
said
be an interesting thing to look out for.
I suppose Drexel does do the Casper and the MMI as well, so they must feel that it does have value in some way, even though they are kind
Yeah.
of seeing similar things.
Sure. Mhm.
Now, another big change that we saw this year was the cancellations of programs. Nicole, do you want to dive into that a little bit?
Yeah. So the major one I think that we were all kind of looking at was SUNY Upstate and like kind of throughout the fall, early early fall, looking for some information on their website, but they did end up accepting a couple of schools this past cycle, but now they are officially canceled effective immediately. Like I said, there were a few programs left that did accept for this past year, but now they are no longer, which is definitely a big hit because there was a lot of seats for like throughout all of those schools that did accept prior. So that
Yeah,
was a big hit.
I was really
Um,
sad to see their program go, and it's interesting to like wonder and speculate like why they canceled. I think it's just like a realignment of missions statements and things like that. But yeah, I think that one was like a really big draw for a lot of our like East Coast students, and even had like a lot of like out of region students get accepted. But it was so flexible, no MCAT. I really do miss the SUNY Upstate programs. I have a lot of kids this year where I'm like, oh, you'd be so perfect for their programs, like based on
Yeah.
your interests and like, what you're kind of looking for out of your career. So it's a little, I'll miss them, but more programs will definitely pop up in its place.
Yeah, same. I have multiple students that I'm so sad they can't apply this year. There are a couple other programs that were canceled as well. University of Central Florida, which was a really sad moment for me. I feel like I've had multiple students every year get into this program. So they reimagined their Burnett Medical Scholars program to not be a full BSMD any longer. And then also the Albion College in Michigan, which was paired with WMed before. We, often work with students in Michigan, so this was another big cancellation that affected us as a team quite a bit with students this year.
So it wasn't all bad news. We did have some programs that did open their doors for the first time this year. So IU Indianapolis, which is like previously known as like the IU PUI kind of Purdue University at Indianapolis, like their school is renamed and now it's IU Indianapolis. I think they unmerged. So Purdue's got also like their own Indianapolis campus. But anyway, it's the IU Indianapolis campus. So you end up matriculating into like IU Med at the end of the day. So their program opened their doors for the first time this year. We did have several students who got accepted and several more students who got put on the wait list and a couple that got off the wait list. So yeah, it's definitely a new program that that's coming together. Another change that we saw was kind of company-wide an increase of students going on the wait list. And so in the past, I know personally I have had some students who were on the wait list, like at Brooklyn College and the AMC programs, but it did seem like a lot more programs, and maybe it's just because we're working with like a bigger volume too, but more students definitely got put on the wait list. Nicole, what were some schools that you kind of noticed having more wait list use?
Yeah. Similar to like kind of what Lindsay was saying, I definitely felt like I was receiving more emails from students this year than ever before about I was accepted to the wait list. And then there was definitely some kids that got off of it. UMKC was one of them this year. UConn is another one that I remember from this year. But it definitely did feel much more prevalent than last.
Yeah, and one thing to know about like the UMKC wait list is like they have almost like little different buckets of students that they pull from. So like they have their in-state students, they've got regional students, so like kids that are from states that are essentially touching Missouri. And then they also have like your out-of-staters or non-regional students. And so those like three different buckets. And so kids will get put on like wait lists like within their own little bucket. And additionally, they also get put on like interview wait lists as well, because they are interviewing like a fair few amount of kids. And so they are waitlisting kids for interviews and then waitlisting them if they want to accept them and don't, want to accept them, but just don't have room right now. So it is definitely a big thing that I think we saw an increase of.
And from my students, I saw a lot of really interesting waitlist action from the Albany Medical College paired schools, RPI, Union, and Siena. I had some students get in just fine to Siena, accepted very early there. And then students who were really, really top contenders, I would say, be placed on the alternate list for RPI. And Union's wait list this year definitely happened after the acceptance rounds from Siena and RPI. There were a lot of students waiting to hear from Union after students had already heard from RPI and Siena, even being placed on alternate lists or acceptances. And I had a student who hadn't heard anything from Union, hadn't heard, and then emailed in to check on the status, was told that she had been placed on the alternate list, and then didn't hear anything, checked in again, and was told that she was denied. So I think that's just something that we're noting moving into next year is Union will find out later students might have to check in about their status, but just to kind of know that about union moving forward. Also, University of South Carolina was a program that utilized their wait list, their alternate list this year as well. It seemed like there was a little bit more of a regional preference there, and then people placed on the alternate list were from a little bit further away geographically, and then there was waitlist movement for our students off of the alternate list at University of South Carolina. So I would say, just as an overall takeaway from this, if you are placed on a wait list or alternate list, it's not the end of the world. In fact, there's a lot of waitlist movement. And so just to kind of take it as a positive and just take the information as they had probably enough regional closer students where they felt more confident in being a student's top choice, but that they did really like you and you're further away. They weren't as confident that you would accept or something like that. And just take it as a win still, and know that an acceptance could easily come off of a wait list or alternate list.
Definitely. I had a lot of kids that moved off wait lists. I had a lot of kids that didn't, but I had a lot of kids that did too. And so, and it could come really at any time. I think that that's the important thing to remember. Like after May 1st, for sure. Like I know for the Albany Medical College ones, I had a kid who was on the wait list for RPI, and he emailed them kind of asking, for a status update as well. And they said, we won't have any movement until after May 1st. And so that's pretty typical because kids are making their decisions. They might be making it on May 1st. And I know some programs did extend it to like May 15th this year. And so I'm assuming we'll probably see some later, we saw kind of some later waitlist stuff than normal, but it could happen. I had a girl last cycle get off the wait list for a BSMD program, and they kind of gave her 48 hours to decide if she wanted to accept or not before they would move on to the next one. So if you do get lucky to get off the wait list, you might have to make a quick choice.
And in that case, so I think across my students specifically, it was probably a 50-50 of the people that moved off of a wait list or that were ultimately rejected from being placed on the wait list. So there's still definitely a chance there. And in all of those cases, again, you're kind of walking with maybe 50% or a little bit less of your chances of getting off the wait list. So in that case, we recommend moving forward to make plans at another school. Don't count on that movement off of a wait list. So move forward with placing a deposit, at a strong in-state pre-med school or another BSMD, but just don't count yourself out of the race completely.
Yeah, completely agree. Make plans, plan for the worst, but hope for the best, is the waitlist policy. So definitely make a contingency plan and be happy about the choice that you do commit to. And then if something happens, it could be great. Now, I suppose we could also discuss the reason potentially why there's an increase of waitlist use. I think I definitely have seen an increase in students applying to more BSMT and honestly traditional schools too. I had very few kids who applied to less than 10 BSMD programs. And I feel like it's because they were had very, very specific goals. Maybe they wanted to stay in state, or they only wanted to apply to programs that let them do a lot of research or things like that. So I feel for the most part though, my kids were doing 15 or more programs this year, regardless of how many I suggested to them, or my advice to them. That was, I think, the trend of what I saw. Is that what you guys too? The college list be bigger?
Absolutely same. The people who did less than 15, it was because of a very specific preference, like staying in state or a neighboring state, a distance from home type of thing, or if there was a tuition cap that they wanted to stay under, things like that. But I saw the same trend.
Yeah, there's a lot of applications this year.
Yeah, I feel I had a couple kids who applied to 50, not programs, but 50 schools or more. Well, at least that's what they were planning to do. And then, once it actually came down to it, I don't know what their number ended up being, but a lot of kids were planning to do a lot. And I was just making a college list for a student last night, and he's got a pretty massive list. I think it was like 18 BSMD and then maybe like 20 traditional, because if you are applying to a lot of these Ivy Leagues or the Dukes and Stanfords and Caltechs of the world, like it's competitive. And so the lists, I think, are definitely expanding. And so because of that, because kids are applying to more, potentially getting more acceptances, I think BSMD programs kind of are recognizing that and realizing, they also have to kind of make contingency plans as well. And then one last kind of change that we saw before we dive into more about the student trends. But one thing that was kind of interesting was like a earlier commitment to some programs, or like a deposit was required early. So a few of the programs that we kind of saw was like FAU, they required an early deposit by March 15th. Mercer required an earlier deposit of April 1st, and then Youngstown State, they were pretty early. I think they just wanted no deposit, but just like more of like a verbal commitment of, that you're coming to the program by January 15th. Now, Nicole, if like a student commits to a program like FAU by March 15th, but then, find out that they got accepted to like their dream school, let's just say it's like Baylor's BSMD, what would you suggest that they do in that case? Like, are they allowed to withdraw their deposit from FAU?
I mean, yeah, you can, just because you left the deposit, I mean, you're not going to get the deposit money back, but they're not, handcuffing you and making you go to the school. You don't have to, things happen. So if you do end up getting into your dream school and, you want to deposit there instead, you would just have to withdraw and let them know that you're no longer coming. And you would obviously forego your seat. You can't kind of flip flop back and forth too much. But the only real responsibility you would have is foregoing that initial deposit.
Michaela, I had a lot of kids ask me this year, because they had early deposits, they wanted to kind of secure their spot. Are you allowed to put down 2 deposits at schools?
Enrollment deposits, you
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, enrollment deposits. Yep.
Yeah, so we really highly encourage students only doing it at one school. Because we don't want to, first of all, you're going to lose that enrollment deposit if you're going to lose one of them when you choose the other schools. So that's just kind of wasted money. And that's where some of these schools like Northeastern that play some games sometimes about, okay, if you place your deposit now, then you'll be, accepted to a different semester or things like that. That's where they want to get your deposit and everything. But we do really highly recommend students only place an enrollment deposit at one school. It's just kind of like playing the game with like fair rules and everything. It's just our recommendation of just how the process should be approached.
And I think, but I could be wrong, that if a college does find out that you double deposited, that they could potentially resend their offer to you.
They can. I don't know if I've ever, it's always been like a friend of a friend that it happened to, so I don't
Yeah.
have seen it actually happen in person, but the threat out there is big enough that I would say just steer away from it.
It's not
I
worth
mean,
it.
the
It's just
enrollment
not worth
deposit
it.
in most cases is refundable up until May 1st. Of course, every school is different and everything, so double check on this, but you can place a deposit, and if you change your mind, you could, get a refund and place a deposit elsewhere. And if that's the case, like that's the route I would recommend doing instead of placing 2 deposits.
Yeah. So if you do get off the wait list, just communicate to the school, withdraw from your like first school that you got accepted to, withdraw, and then put the deposit down at the second one. So I mean, I guess technically you kind of have 2 deposits down at the same time, but as long as you're communicating that you want to withdraw from the other school, it's okay. You're not committed to your first school that you put the deposit down.
Mm-hmm. And I think another piece of the puzzle is as soon as you put down an enrollment deposit, they're going to start hounding you about placing a housing deposit. And some of those emails can get kind of scary, like, oh, we're running out of space. And like, all the spots at the good dorm are gone now, and they really start to kind of, I don't know, ask for a lot more money, and the housing deposits are very rarely refundable, definitely not fully refundable. And so you're just likely going to be paying more money overall to eventually switch your mind.
I do feel like they'd start to kind of bully you a little bit into like, hey, you're accepted, leave your deposit, and they'll leave, the link is right there because they want you to, guarantee. Um, but kind of piggybacking off of what Michaela's saying about housing, I have absolutely seen them do that where it's like you're gonna, space is running out. Stony Brook, I think it was yesterday in the news, just posted or it came out that they are legitimately out of dorm space for this upcoming class who's incoming in the fall. They have no
What
more
school is
space
it?
for students. Stony Brook.
Stony Brook. It's
Wow.
Yeah,
definitely happened at
it does
Northeastern
happen.
and
Yeah,
Boston University. I mean, it definitely happens.
it
Oh
does.
yeah.
Yeah, it does happen.
When I
But
was in college, like people like the first month of college, like literally slept in like I'm trying to remember what those like rooms are called, like the kind of communal rooms. Like they didn't have enough dorm space, so they would put like 5 or 6 people like in those like
Like the rec rooms.
the
Yeah.
rec rooms. Exactly. They didn't have dorms for like the first month until like kids probably dropped out or left or whatever it is. And so yeah, it definitely could happen. It definitely could
it does
happen.
happen. Yeah, like once you're sure and you are going to leave your enrollment deposit, like just go ahead and leave your housing deposit if you're going to live there, but don't feel pressured to leave your enrollment deposit before you're absolutely
Yeah,
sure. Um, and before whatever deadline there is for that specific program, if it's
definitely.
not May 1st.
So we'll talk a little bit kind of generally about student trends. But before we talk about it, I just wanted to say like a big like caveat. It's, we're going to talk a lot about scores and like things we saw in like successful resumes. And just because you have these things that we talk about, it does not mean you are automatically going to be accepted. Um, and just because you don't have these things does not mean you're automatically rejected. Like everything is holistic. These are just things that we're kind of pointing out that we saw. So take everything with a grain of salt and don't panic as you listen to this. This is more just like general than anything else. So keep that in mind as we go along.
Yeah,
Uh,
there have been everything that we talk about, there have been exceptions both ways, for the positive and for the negative. This is very general.
mhm. Okay, so Nicole, do you want to kick us off? What were some of like the scores you saw from successful applicants?
Yeah. Let's see. Definitely above a 33. And I know like we kind of say that generally, like what's like a safe and what's a decent score to be a competitive applicant, but I really did only see my, true acceptances above that number. And I did unfortunately see students who had stellar applications, essays, extracurriculars who just weren't at that mark,
Mhm.
not getting those acceptances. So I do think that it moves the needle for these schools. And then I think SAT is a little bit harder to gauge. I think maybe because the numbers are broader.
Mhm.
um, most of them were like 15, 40 and above, I believe. And again, the ones that were kind of hovering around that 1500 were not seeing the same types of acceptances as the ones that were above.
Yeah, just to jump in, I feel like last year I had many students who were around the 1470, 1480 SAT range that had no problem getting into multiple programs. And then this year, I feel like those same students, similar resumes and GPAs, but those same kind of scores did not see the same success that I saw like last year and the year before. So I really saw BSMD success starting at the 15, 10, 15, 20 mark. And I think it's just a reflection on how competitive these BSMD programs truly are. They have no shortage of applicants. They're only becoming more competitive as programs cancel and everything. Fewer seats. And so it's just a moment of reflection on, you know, really evaluating if students are a strong candidate for BSMDs or not as we move into these college list meetings in the summer.
Yeah, last year, prior, I definitely saw 32s, 33s, like you said, getting in, and this year was just not the case, unfortunately.
And I did not have, I don't think I had any, actually, now I'm thinking about it, I had a few test optional students who applied. I think just one actually this past cycle, no success. There's only a very few BSMD programs that accept test optional students, and they tend to be like the uber competitive ones. And so, yeah, test optional, I think is not really a super viable option unless you do have like a stellar application otherwise, but it's just really, really tough to do that.
Yeah, I'll have to say I've never had a BSMD success with someone that went test optional, not once. And so I'm sure there has been, historically other people with successes. I personally have not had
I
any
just
success.
had, I've just had one at Penn
Mhm.
State. And he did have a good resume otherwise, great GPA. I think he had like, I don't remember, he was like not this current cycle, but the one before it. I think had a 4.0, pretty heavy in research and like did volunteering in like a hospital and things like that. So he did have like a good resume otherwise, but his test score, I can't remember what it was. I think in the 1300s. And so we went test optional to everywhere we could. So it's definitely tricky because I've maybe had like 5 or 6 test optional students and just success with one. I think it is tougher. Okay, and then what about GPA? I don't think we addressed that, did we? Have you noticed like any trends in the GPAs? Like are schools requiring like a 4.0, or do you think that a 3.7 could be successful?
I feel like the success that I saw was definitely students having above a 3.9 unweighted. Most of my students who had strong acceptances across the board, Siena, University of South Carolina, and then even non-BSMD like MIT and Duke and some of those schools, they were all around the 4.0 unweighted mark. And then of course their weighted was higher. Um, and so I think it's just a thing, again, going back to these programs have no shortage of like great candidates to choose from. And I I did not see the same success with my students that had, around the 3.5, 3.6 mark.
Oh yeah, I think a 3.5, 3.6 is really tough. I have had a few students with like a 3.6 get accepted, like a high 3.6 get accepted to BSMD, but um, she applied to a ton of programs and had a really awesome resume otherwise, but it is tough. I think 3.8 or higher is like the baseline goal that I always tell kids. Now, what about extracurriculars? What kind of extracurriculars have you kind of noticed, maybe a change in years past on successful resumes?
Yeah, I'll jump in for that one. I feel like, when we're advising students, we're always going to tell them to, pick up that shadowing, pick up some volunteering, focus on your medical related. And it's kind of just become the norm. Everyone has those things. So I think the kind of what else? I've had a lot of success, oddly enough, with students that have had jobs, and not like a tutoring job or like a coaching job. I think that's pretty common, but a job where they're interacting with other adults, like working in a restaurant. I always feel like food service industry is huge for like building soft skills. Working at a supermarket, where you're constantly talking with people at the checkout, um, having small problems that you're problem solving for, and just a lot of the soft skill building types of activities. I also feel like it lends to just the way that they present themselves in front of other adults. So when it comes down to interviewing and having conversations with these admissions representatives, they, I think, maybe just carry themselves a little bit better. But that was kind of one this past year and the year before, when I'm looking back at extracurriculars, that is definitely something that has stood out to me for students that have had success.
And one thing I would piggyback off on like the differences too is like kids are definitely not having any virtual shadowing on their application anymore. I did have like someone ask me that recently, so it just like popped back into my head. Virtual shadowing is just, if there's no other options available, it's fine. But I feel like a lot of other kids now have access to in-person shadowing. So I would say that that was the big trend, is kind of shifting away from those types of activities.
I think they were great while when we needed it back in like 2020, but yeah, I agree. Now it's
Yeah.
kind of irrelevant.
Thankfully, we can do in person now.
Another thing that I saw was students who had great local involvement. You know, they're volunteering, they're starting an initiative, they see something, a gap that needs to be filled in their local community, but then also having that nice blend of local involvement with their time, but then, you know, kind of more national awards like the Coca-Cola Scholars. That seemed to be a really nice balance that tended to work out well with successful applicants.
Another one that I just thought of, I don't know if you have had similar this year, but I had two students this past cycle who were EMTs, they're EMS certified, which I feel like it kind of covers two bases. I mean, they're not really volunteering because they are actually like doing the work themselves and like responding to these emergencies. But I wasn't sure. And the two that I had did have a lot of success this year. Um, but I was wondering if have you guys seen that this year? Do you have a lot of students that did that?
Yeah. And of course, it's like only available to like kids in certain states. So like if
Agreed. Yeah.
you're like, oh my God, I can't do it, that means it's over. No, like they
No.
know. Um,
Yeah.
and I think New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and UN or not UNC, North Carolina. I feel like
North
those are,
Carolina.
I've seen kids do it. And there might be other states as well, but I do think it's nice when they can, because it's like such a good hands-on experience. Like you're kind of in that hectic, chaotic environment too. And even if you're obviously not as hands-on as like you might want to be, I think it's a good experience overall. Takes
Mhm.
time. And that's like, I think another benefit of it, like you have to go through kind of an intensive certification process with the tests and things like that. So it just kind of, once again, proves your interest in medicine.
Yep.
And I always tell kids too, like if you don't get accepted to a BSMD program or end up going to like a traditional school, you're already certified. And so like you can immediately start working like on as an EMT or like on the EMS squads or whatever it is. And kind of have a leg up on getting clinical exposure and kind of those hands-on experiences at a young age. So I think it's a good benefit.
And building your
I think
resume
it's a
towards
great
medical
benefit.
school. Mhm.
And typically there's like EMS, EMT squads on college campuses, and I feel like those jobs are pretty hard to get. But if you are already coming in with experience for it, then would probably have a better chance of getting those roles versus someone who still needs to get certified and doesn't have any experience.
Mhm. A nice built-in resume building activity as you progress towards medical school. Absolutely.
And what do you guys notice about like kids who've got like spikes in their resume? Did you have a lot of kids with like very particular interests? Like in the years past, I've had kids who maybe been really passionate about like anti-vaping for kids. So they do research kind of related to vaping and the dangers of it. They do kind of like dare, but for anti-vaping, they have tried to change like legislation and like are involved in like their city councils, once again, kind of related to like the anti-vaping conversation. And then you have some kids who are just like more well-rounded, who like, maybe do research related to like dementia, but then also volunteer at the animal shelter and, do arts and crafts and, with younger kids or speech and debate, like, have a lot of eclectic interests. Have you noticed like one resume doing better than the other this application cycle?
I have not. I think my students who had really strong spikes did really, really well. But I also had some students that were more well-rounded that also had strong success. I think it probably depends on the type of program. So my students with the really strong spikes had good success at, RPI, Siena, University of South Carolina, the schools that kind of have a preference for something over another, community service or research, and then their spike kind of matched that. And then my more well-rounded students had great success at, say, like Hofstra and Drexel and some of the BSDOs. And so I think it was just a mix, but also paying attention to the programs they were applying to.
Yeah, I would kind of agree. My students that have, that really concentrated interest, I think those students always do well because I think it's easy to stay like a cohesive applicant and they're very intentional on the activities that they do. Um, I did though have some where it's like, wow, they have so much research, they're going to be like a great fit for this program. And they kind of throw their eggs into the programs that they'll be great fits for that really, really catch their interest. And maybe they're a little bit more specific about which schools they want to apply to. They don't want to apply to schools that don't have like a heavy research interest. And then it didn't work out necessarily in their favor, where they could have had more acceptances if they would have been open to applying to other schools that weren't specifically, what their interests were. Um, but yeah, then a lot of DO acceptances for those really well-rounded students that have a ton of different things on their resume.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's not one right way to do it. It could be great either way. So that's, I think, the most important thing to kind of remember. It's everyone is definitely different.
I think stay true to your interests, and I think it's easiest to write about things that you're very, very interested in. So if you just did these activities to try to well round yourself and you're not really passionate about it, writing about it is going to be harder than this is your true passion. And if you want to stick to your little corner of interest, um, it'll be easier to talk about. I don't know.
Yes, I completely agree. And as we're talking about things too, just because like a kid who got into Brown's program and they did like certain activities, recreating their resume is and things that you're not passionate about is not going to be effective. Exactly what Nicole said. They want passion, they want interest, they want you to like care about things, and like they can always sniff out if you actually cared about things or not. Just pay attention to those types of things. What's anything else you kind of notice about the successful students this cycle? Any like other like qualities or things you'd like to highlight?
I feel like students that carry themselves extremely well from day one, it's almost easy to see that they're going to have or they might have more success. Students that are confident, students that are, really going out of their way to make appointments with us and be on top of their own, agenda and schedule and thinking ahead and are just like super intentional with their time during the calls. Just like that emotional maturity, I think is hard because you can't really teach it, but um, I think those students do have a lot of success. So potentially picking up extracurriculars that are going to give you some of those soft skills if you don't feel like that's something that you are strong with. Um, could help.
Yeah, same. I think the students that were as on top of it as our counselors are, initiating meetings and wanting to check in about X, Y, and Z. And just following up with us as much as we do them, not as opposed to the students that were kind of, having to chase down to schedule meetings and they only want like one round of edits on their essays. The students are just really putting in the time and effort on this and really caring about their college applications. Absolutely far and away had more success than the students that we kind of had to pull along a little bit more. And so I think that's just an intention and an emotional maturity thing to pay attention to as as you're evaluating your BSMD list.
Especially during the interview phase too. You know, we can't say that being president of this club over that club, it's like going to be more beneficial. And, you know, your essays definitely show your voice and show that passion. But once you're in front of them, whether it be virtual, you know, on a conversation or in person, I think that's exactly where a lot of that maturity is truly seen. And I think those are the ones that like make that final cut
I
versus not. Because we've had some great, you know, stellar candidates who get those interviews, and unfortunately it just doesn't work out. And I think that looking at profiles like on paper, that's really the only difference, is the students that could carry themselves professionally versus the ones that maybe lacked.
completely agree. Yeah. I think that's like if you had to put like your finger on like one quality that they're really looking for, besides like passion, obviously for medicine, but and passion in general, but emotional maturity is such a thing that's hard to learn and it's hard to teach. But those kids who do have it, I completely agree. They can look great on paper, but in interviews, it kind of comes through a lot more. Right, so I think that's it from us today. Thanks so much for listening to our episode of the White Coat Club. Be sure to like and subscribe for more future content. But until then, see you next time.